Shadows of Britain, True Crime. The Angel Makers, Britain's forgotten poison plot. There are killers who strike in violence, and there are killers who work quietly or patiently, believing that death delivered gently enough will go unnoticed. In the late Victorian and Edwardian years, long before modern forensics reshaped justice, Britain lived with a dangerous comfort. Poison was ordinary. Arsenic lined shelves in chemists' shops. Fly papers were soaked in it. Rat poison contained it. Medicine bottles sat beside teacups on kitchen tables. And in that world a pattern began to emerge, one so subtle that it took years to recognize. They were later called the Angel Makers. Unlike the notorious poison rings of continental Europe, Britain's Angel Makers were not a single gang. They were individuals, often women, operating in small towns and villages, using domestic familiarity as cover. Their victims were rarely strangers. They were elderly husbands, unwanted children, lodgers, sick relatives, anyone whose death could be explained away as illness. In a time when death certificates relied heavily on local doctors and observation rather than laboratory science, a quiet poisoning could resemble natural decline. And that was the key. Arsenic was the perfect weapon, colorless, nearly tasteless, slow enough to mimic disease. Symptoms looked like common ailments: stomach pains, vomiting, weakness. In overcrowded industrial Britain, such complaints were ordinary. Few questioned them. Poison became invisible because illness already was. One of the most infamous British poison plots unfolded in the early 1900s, when investigators began noticing unusual patterns of inheritance claims and sudden deaths tied to certain households. Women who appeared devoted caregivers were repeatedly present when husbands or infants died unexpectedly. Insurance payments followed. So did whispers. The method was deceptively simple. Fly papers, commonly used to trap insects, were soaked in water, releasing arsenic into a liquid that could be added to tea or food. Because fly papers were a normal household item, few suspected them as a source of murder. Victims weakened slowly, families mourned publicly, and the cycle continued. What eventually exposed the Angel Makers was not confession, but pattern recognition. Doctors began noticing repeated symptoms. Local authorities compared death records. Insurance agents raised concerns. Small inconsistencies grew too numerous to ignore. Investigators exhumed bodies, and for the first time, chemical testing revealed arsenic preserved within human remains, even years after burial. The dead began to testify. Trials that followed shocked Edwardian society. Respectable women stood accused of calculated murder. Newspapers struggled to reconcile domestic images, aprons, teacups, nursery rooms, with the reality of deliberate poisoning. Some defendants claimed mercy killings, others denied everything. A few showed chilling indifference, convinced that their actions would never be proven. But forensic science had changed the rules. Poison was no longer invisible. What makes Britain's Angel Maker cases unsettling is not their scale, but their normality. There were no dark alleys, no sudden violence, no dramatic struggle. Just kitchens, bedrooms, quiet conversations. Death arrived slowly, disguised as care. These cases forced Britain to rethink trust within the home. Laws changed around poison sales. Record-keeping improved. The idea that domestic spaces could harbor calculated violence began to reshape policing and medicine alike. The Angel Makers did not hunt strangers. They operated within relationships, and that made them harder to see and harder to believe. Today, their stories sit on the edge of history, overshadowed by more sensational crimes. Yet their impact remains profound. They showed that murder does not always roar. Sometimes it dissolves quietly into tea. Sometimes it looks like kindness. And sometimes the most dangerous place in Britain was not a dark street, but a familiar kitchen where death was served one cup at a time.
In early 1910, London was a city where people could disappear without much notice. It was crowded, busy, and oddly impersonal, the kind of place where absence could pass as explanation. One such disappearance was that of Dr Crippen, a lively American music hall performer known to audiences as Belle Elmore. She lived with her husband, Hawley Harvey Crippen, at 39 Hilldrop Crescent, Holloway, North London. The couple could not have been more different. Cora was outgoing, sociable, and extravagant. Crippen was quiet, precise, and withdrawn, a small, softly spoken man who worked as a homeopathic doctor. Their marriage was strained, sustained more by routine than affection. Then, in January 1910, Cora vanished. Crippen told friends his wife had returned to America. Later, he altered the story, claiming she had fallen ill and died overseas. There was no funeral, no death certificate, and no physical proof, only Crippen's word. At first, no one challenged him, but within weeks, Crippen began appearing in public with another woman, Ethel Leneve, his young secretary. She moved into the house. She wore Cora's jewelry. She occupied the space Cora had left behind. Members of Cora's social circle, particularly from the Music Hall Ladies Guild, became uneasy. Too many details did not add up. Too much time had passed without confirmation of Cora's death. They contacted the police. When officers searched the house at Hilltop Crescent, they initially found nothing unusual. It was clean, orderly, and unremarkable. But in the cellar, beneath the brick floor, they uncovered human remains. There was no complete body, no skull, no limbs, only fragments, skin, muscle, and tissue. Among them was a section of abdomen bearing a surgical scar consistent with a hysterectomy Cora had undergone years earlier. It was enough to prove that someone had been killed inside the house. By the time the discovery was made, Crippen and Leneve had already fled England. Disguising Leneve as a young boy, they boarded the SS Montrose, bound for Canada. Crippen believed distance would protect him, just as it had when he claimed Cora had died abroad. But technology had changed. The ship's captain grew suspicious of the pair and sent a wireless telegraph message ahead to British authorities. Police were waiting when the ship reached port, and Crippen was arrested. At trial at the Old Bailey, the prosecution presented medical evidence and expert testimony. They showed that Crippen had purchased hyoscine, a powerful sedative, shortly before Cora disappeared. The fragments beneath the cellar floor told a story of dismemberment and concealment. Crippen denied murdering his wife. The jury did not believe him. In November 1910, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was executed by hanging at Holloway Prison. Ethel Leneve was acquitted, judged to have acted out of ignorance rather than intent. The house at Hilltop Crescent was later altered, renumbered, and eventually demolished. But the case endured. What makes the Crippen murder so disturbing is not violence, but ordinariness. There was no public struggle, no obvious brutality, only a quiet home, a controlled man, and a body hidden beneath the floor. Crippen believed that absence could be explained away, that society would accept convenience over truth. For a time it did. But the house remembered, and in the end that was enough.